The date of the Exodus should be a dry academic debate. Instead, it has become a fiery storm of controversy. Find out why on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Last month, when I released my debate with Titus Kennedy over the date of the Exodus, which was censored, I received some comments like the one from Peter von Bergen. Quote, "I don't understand why this is so sensitive. You discussed about two different views on the timing of the Exodus. Very interesting. So what? Why such a buzz about it?" And honestly, I understand why some people would have this reaction to the debate. Despite the debate being very one-sided, as far as debates go, it was very genteel compared to other exchanges on topics such as creation evolution, abortion, or LGBT issues inside of the church. And even when I first got into this subject as my personal field of academic study, it was almost an afterthought. My thinking was, it's just about a date. Who'd care? Boy, was I wrong. And this video is all about why I was wrong. Now, on the surface, the debate over the date of the Exodus seems like a niche topic that would interest very few people. However, it's a subject where many controversial issues intersect, which makes it a powder keg subject. Recently, a pastor friend of mine who was curious about the appeal of the subject sent a poll to 59 of his colleagues, who were church pastors and elders. He asked them if they had an opinion on the date of the Exodus, how strongly they held their opinion, and could they articulate the arguments for or against it. The results were fascinating. Opinion was split along denominational lines. The majority held their opinions strongly, and no one could articulate the arguments. Fundamentalists and strongly conservative evangelicals held fast to an early Exodus date, while mainline Protestants leaned towards a late Exodus date. This reveals that this issue is not just an academic debate, but an issue of religious dogma. Since it has become a dogma, we are dealing with a new level of epistemological complexity. This behooves us to try to untangle why the date of the Exodus has become a dogma and why it is so emotionally charged. To do that, we need to look at the history of the debate. In the mid-19th century, there was a lot of interest in tying biblical events to the modern Gregorian calendar. And generally, the debate over the date of the Exodus was between Jewish and Christian believers. In 1853, C.R. Lepsius proposed that the Exodus took place during the reigns of Merneptah or Ramses II, and this remained the dominant view for 50 years. However, towards the end of the 19th century, German higher criticism dominated biblical scholarship, not the least of which was Julius Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis. These new theories challenged biblical authorship, inerrancy, and authority. And many grassroots churches opposed these new hermeneutical approaches. In 1906, a Scottish theologian, James Orr, wrote a large tome that argued against these new critical theories and came out in favor of traditional readings of the Bible. His ideas were largely rejected in Europe, but welcomed with open arms in the more biblically conservative North America. But in addition to his embracing of the traditional views, James Orr also introduced a new idea. He believed that one could calculate the date of the Exodus using 1 Kings 6:1, and that the king of the Exodus was Amenhotep II. In short, Orr had invented the modern view of the early Exodus date. And since that time, the early Exodus date became associated with theological conservatism, even though it was at the time a radical new reading. In many respects, the early Exodus date became associated with the early volleys in what in the 1930s would become the fundamentalist modernist controversy. So, on the one hand, we are dealing with an unofficial dogma that is loosely associated with conservative denominationalism. On the other hand, we are also dealing with a hermeneutical controversy. The early Exodus date and the late Exodus date take different hermeneutical approaches. Now, while the early Exodus date suggests a 1446 date for the Exodus, the late Exodus date assumes that the Exodus took place around 1260-1265 BC. Now, for its hermeneutical approach, the late Exodus date follows the grammatical historical method that has been accepted since Dom Calmet and the Protestant Reformation. The early Exodus date, on the other hand, uses an ad hoc literalism that gives numbers interpretive priority. The hermeneutical method used by the early Exodus date generally reads the genealogies in the Bible the same way as would be done in Western Europe or North America. It is a distinctly Western reading of the biblical texts. As such, it reads genealogies literally and anachronistically, while at the same time cherry-picking which data it chooses to read in this manner. For example, it tends to ignore genealogies as are found in, for example, Exodus chapter 6. And it is no coincidence that these same methods are used by American young earth creationists. As such, the date of the Exodus becomes important for American young earth creationists as well. If the early Exodus date fails, so does American young earth creationism, because it would invalidate their reading of the Bible. A late Exodus date would be unacceptable to American young earth creationists, since it would draw the date of the Genesis flood into the 22nd century BC, which is well into the period of written recorded history. In addition, this hermeneutical issue bleeds into questions of biblical authority and inerrancy, and both sides have a claim to make in this regard. Early Exodus date supporters would make the claim that because the late Exodus date uses history to interpret the Bible, this erodes biblical authority, because we are listening to the word of man instead of the word of God. Their approach is to accept history as long as it fits with the early Exodus date. When it is not consistent, they either force history to fit the interpretation, or say to just wait until archaeology digs up more evidence because God will vindicate his word in the end. The problem here is that digging up more evidence will not contradict the evidence we already have. And ultimately, what has happened here is that the early Exodus date supporters have confused their interpretation for biblical authority. At the same time, too, late Exodus date supporters have their own issue here, which is that inerrancy depends upon the Bible being consistent and concordant with history per the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy. If the date of the Exodus puts events out of sync with history, then that's a problem for inerrancy. Furthermore, the early Exodus date supporters use their readings of 1 Kings 6:1 as a litmus test, as a sort of doctrinal purity test. The idea is that if you read 1 Kings 6:1 as 479 literal years, then you probably read the rest of the Bible using an ad hoc literalism, you are an American young earth creationist, and you are probably an ardent traditionalist. The use of the early Exodus date in this way is to create an in-group out-group divide that panders upon the fear that if one does not hold to their, albeit recent, traditions, then one will slide down the slippery slope of liberalism and atheism. On the flip side, what if each side were to lose this debate? Admittedly, the late Exodus date supporters have less to lose if they are wrong. The late Exodus date is an intellectual position upon which only inerrancy hangs in the balance. Being wrong as a late Exodus date supporter means having to retreat into a position where the history of the Bible matters less. Conversely, the early Exodus date supporters have a lot at stake. They don't only lose biblical authority, but also lose the question of where did life come from, as well as lose their basis for reading the Bible and their perceived American traditions. This makes the early Exodus date a high-stakes proposition where there can be no compromise. As such, groups like the Associates for Biblical Research have garnered grassroots support in churches, denominations, and seminaries, building up support for their view. It is important to note that supporters of the early Exodus date typically do not debate their position. Few debates have ever taken place that have not turned into complete routs. So they normally shy away from academic discourse, preferring to take a missionary approach, trying to convince those in the pews. But because their view cannot be defended academically, and the stakes are so high, early Exodus date supporters will take steps that often go beyond trying to convince others through the persuasiveness of their arguments, often using money and brute influence when words fail. To sum up, the debate over the date of the Exodus is a mess. It is a perfect storm of cooperating interests and controversies. It is a toxic blend of fundamentalism, American young earth creationism, a distortion of biblical authority, exclusivism, and a high-stakes proposition backed by money and power. Add to that a lit match, and holders of the early Exodus date will do whatever it takes to win what it thinks to be a winner-takes-all religious position. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something today. I'm glad you were with us today, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.